Hello, everyone. My name is Christina Whitf-Perry. I'm publishing director for Comfort and Carnac Books, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today for our online book launch for Annie Power's wonderful new book, Contented Couples, Magic, Logic or Luck, which published in the UK on the 14th of June, and I have a copy here to show you. I don't know how many of you have managed to get a copy yet, but I hope you will all want to buy a copy, certainly after this book launch. As many of you will be aware, Comfort began producing books in 2020. In fact, we produced our first 6 titles at the very start of the first national lockdown in the UK. I think it was on the 16th of March. So that was an experience. And we now house 2 publishing imprints, Comfort Books and Carnac Books. Comfort Books are for anyone interested in psychotherapeutic ideas, designed to make insights from psychological, relational, and emotional processes accessible to a wide audience of readers. And Annie Power's book sits in that imprint and is a Comfort book. And we also have Carnac Books, which are books designed for mental health professionals and trainees to enrich their practice, enhance theoretical understanding, and deepen knowledge of the history of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. And as I said, we've been going for about 2 years. And in preparation for this book launch, I looked back at the correspondence I've had with Annie and realized that my conversations with her started back in May of 2020. Which was a few months after I had arrived at Comfort to build up the publishing program. And 2 years on, we are here celebrating the publication of this wonderful work on couples, an in-depth exploration of how 2 individuals can meet, fall in love, or at least fall into step, and continue side by side through the ups and downs of life. Annie's book enables us to listen in on couples as they talk about their experiences and guides us to a richer understanding of how to reach contentment in a relationship. And I do think it's a really wonderful book, and I'm absolutely delighted that we have had the opportunity to help bring it into the world. And now I have the delight of being able to introduce our 2 speakers. So we have our author, Annie Power. She's a couples therapist. She trained with the Bowlby Centre and in emotion-focused therapy for couples after a previous career as a nurse. And she also has an MA in history and has worked on oral history projects and sees her interviewing and story collecting as borrowing from that tradition as well. After working for 25 years with clients in difficulty, she has had a strong curiosity to hear how contented couples describe their experience. And that is what we can see in her book. Dr. Kathrine Bejanyan, her conversation partner for this afternoon, is a practicing therapist and relationship consultant in central London. She works with individuals and couples on love, dating, and relationship issues with a focus on building deeper intimacy, connection, and authenticity in their love life. Outside of her private practice, Kathrine is a speaker consultant as well as a lecturer in psychology, and she holds a PhD in social psychology and a master's in counselling psychology. She's an accredited member of the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy with a license as a marriage family therapist from the United States. So we're really honoured to have both of you here, and I'm really looking forward to listening what you have to say and to learning more about the book.
And thank you everyone for coming on a Saturday online. It's I feel a bit guilty about making people sit inside in front of a screen, but thank you anyway.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. It's a good starting point for a Saturday, working on your relationship. So yeah, it's a good starting point for the weekend.
So Kathrine, you're going to help me by asking questions.
Yes. Okay. So I thought a good starting point for a discussion would be to talk about the beginning of the book itself. So you and I met many years ago. I was actually looking at our email correspondence in 2016 when I saw you speaking at a conference about this very topic. And my research at the time during my PhD was on sort of cross-cultural relationships in the East and the West. So I was looking at a lot of arranged marriage versus romantic relationships. And your talk was fascinating. So I remember coming straight up to you, and that's how you and I started our friendship. And I remember our first discussion revolved around the fact that you had sort of mentioned that this is a topic you were really interested in and that you were considering writing a book. and that was back in 2016. So this book didn't just happen overnight, right? It's been brewing for a long time, and there's quite a lot of work that you have put into it. So why don't we start from there? Tell us a little bit about how the idea for the book came about, how you went about writing it, finding your couples. Give us a little bit of insight into your own mind and the book.
Thank you. That's such a lovely broad question. I think that the place I started was where probably all therapists who work with couples sit, well, in the West, which is so many couples arrive looking for help, and they have a memory of when they first got together and how wonderful it was. And they actually have a sort of a terrible sadness, loss, or sometimes a resentment about how it's gone wrong. And so I gradually, I had some awareness through my own life of people in arranged marriages. And I became aware of the sort of different trajectories that the romantic couples start on top of the mountain, and they tend to fall off it, and then they have to pick themselves up again. And the people in an arranged marriage, they kind of more or less start low down on the trail, and they work up gradually. When I say romantic couples falling off a mountain, I'm talking about people who have that experience of falling in love. It's a neurochemical experience. It's like being on drugs, and it does not last. Now, sometimes people say, oh, I'm still in love with my partner. We've been together 50 years. I've yet to be persuaded of that. That definitely there are people who are maybe it's a deeper love, a huge love, but it's not that early limerence neuro cocktail, which actually is a very misleading experience for couples and almost is something they have to recover from. And so I became very interested in if you almost lined up the different ways people meet, and I take it as three broad groups: the what I call random romance, the arranged marriage where the family get involved, or self-arranged marriage, which is almost becoming the norm now in the West, where people go online and seek. Or in the people I interviewed, because I wanted people who've been together many years, I only had a few online couples. My self-arranged marriages were people who met through an agency or were deliberately set up by friends, which in the past was the way you could do it if you weren't just relying on Cupid to arrive. I became very interested in, so what are the strengths and pitfalls of each method?
Yeah, and I think that what I really love about the book is how it outlines that regardless of, what your background is or where you started off, that there's an evolution and a development to the relationship, and how people could start at different points and still end up in a really healthy and successful relationship, or otherwise, right? Or the challenges. But this book really focused on what works. And I think that's really refreshing. It reminded me of the fact that, in psychology, we tend to look at things that are problematic and challenging, but actually looking at things that work is really helpful in being able to work from backwards and try to implement that into our own lives to hopefully end up in a successful place. So I think that your book really, really was significant in that. I really liked also how you sort of really discussed and unpacked how in each situation, whether it's a romantic match, whether it's an arranged marriage, that there are different challenges and struggles. So there is no one is better than the other. I think sometimes in the West, we uphold falling in love as the most significant and important ingredient, that without that sort of intense spark and chemistry, it's impossible to have a successful relationship. And yet what you outlined is that a successful relationship is built over time, right? Did you see any sort of commonalities between the different couples and the way that they went about it and how they sort of constructed a successful, contented relationship?
Definitely, and you're meaning across the spectrum, where the commonality. Yeah. Well, that was the conclusion I came to, that actually the strengths in whichever courtship group people came from, really what, I mean, it's not rocket science what I came to, but I came to the conclusion that the thing that makes it work for people is that they're prepared to learn, that they have a curiosity about their partner and about their own experience, and that they're able to learn. And that across the board was what I think made these couples contented.
Yeah, I think that was really an empowering message, right? That it's not that somehow destiny or luck shines a light on you and then you end up with a happy relationship, but there is a strong personal engagement and an agency on your part that regardless of where you start, however you come together, that there is something that you can do to create this experience. Speaking of that, the other empowering point I found was in the beginning of the book when you touched on the concept of good enough marriage. So do you want to elaborate on that? Because I thought, you know, this is really significant. It's not that we have to have an amazing, we have to do everything right, but if we are good enough, so I'll let you sort of take it away and sort of unpack that concept.
I definitely want to. What I'm aware of is I had because Kathrine and I slightly pre-taught what we would do. And one of the ideas is I'll read a little bit from the book. Yes. And I think I'll just do that first, relating to where we just were, which is definitely not there's one person, there's only one other person out there in the world. It's not all just luck. But I rather like, there was one, I found this when I've done research before, it's rather a nice feeling when actually one's assumptions get overturned. And there is one couple in the book who rather overturned that assumption that you know, you can build, there's many possible partners out there that can make it work. And this couple, I gave, those of you who've looked at the book will know, I gave each of the couples a moniker. And I originally did this because when I was handling all the names and working out which bits of script I would use and so on, I actually interviewed 22 couples. So that makes 44 names. And of course, I gave them all what do you call false names? They all have made up names, which they usually approved or chose themselves. So that made 88 names. It was too much for me to handle. So I really, for myself, but I pretty soon realized it would be good in the book. I gave them monikers. So the couple I'm going to read a bit from their dialogue. I called them actually originally the bespoke couple, but it was pointed out that that wouldn't work so well in America. And half of these couples are from the States, so the book has to work in America. And this couple are American. So actually we changed it to the Tailor-made couple. And the thing is, these are a couple who found a needle in a haystack, really. And that was overturning my assumption, which is actually you can make it work with most people. So this is an arranged marriage couple, and they're arranged in a pretty traditional way. And for those who haven't read the book, I'm not dealing at all with forced marriage. That's of no interest to me. It's an abuse of human rights. But an arranged marriage is where the family has a strong input into the process. So this couple are American, and so just a little background, that their two mothers had handled the sifting of the candidates. And once both families were happy and the two individuals said they were pretty happy with the suggestion, then a meeting was arranged, and they were living in different states. So the man with his family traveled to the home of the young woman, and the families met, and then there was a very short meeting for the two young people alone. Annie, do you remember what you said to each other in the 15 minutes? Bisma, I was just asking him, like, do you mind if after finishing school I start work right away? And he said, yeah, that's what I prefer. I also asked him, are you open to moving? Because at that time he was in a small town and I've lived in bigger cities throughout my life and I preferred that. He said, yeah, wherever I get a good job. And I remember what he was asking me. He said that he has an American friend. Both of them started to laugh at this point. And he comes to his home and sometimes he drinks alcohol. As Muslims, we don't serve alcohol in our home. He was asking me, am I okay if his friend comes and drinks in our home? Our family outlook is very traditional. So he was thinking that I'm like my family and I won't have American friends. But in my mind, I was thinking, I also have American friends who have tattoos and even piercings. So I was thinking, if this friend comes, then that means I can keep my friends too. Faisal, if you really think about it, we're both unusual in our families. We're very, very broad focused, right? The fear was she won't be able to approve my lifestyle, or I won't be able to approve her lifestyle. But it actually turned out to be exactly the opposite. But in order for the arrangement to work, the families have to match. They have to be aligned. So they really would have had, they both turned down a lot of propositions, and it was only when they found each other it was right. So that was lovely. But like many of the couples, they had their stormy times early on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it sort of really highlights that even within the context of the arranged marriage, there's a desire to find beyond the external necessities that families require, that they're still seeking a connection, right? A partnership. You can really see that throughout the book when reading about the different couples. It was like they were trying to forge some kind of connection beyond the external things. I want to touch on the concept of the familiar and the fascinating. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that, and what draws us together? Because I think, again, in this situation, what you just read out, it sort of highlights that there's a sense of familiarity, things that we expect and we're used to, and then something that we find interesting and fascinating about the other that's unique.
Yes, that does relate to this couple quite strongly, and this is general couple theory that I'm using, but I've distilled it in calling it the fascinating and the familiar. That's my kind of distilled version of it, and this is the fact that we can probably see in ourselves, in our own experience of who we're drawn to, and we can see it in other couples around, that we do tend to fall in love with someone who carries the underdeveloped part of the self. And this actually was the case with these two. They only had 15 minutes to choose, and they told about choosing on that basis, which clearly was important. But like most of the other couples in an arranged marriage, they'd had this short meeting alone. And I think in that short meeting, it was enough for them to pick up these unconscious messages about how different, how similar is this person. And a few of the couples in arranged marriages said that they sometimes said to each other, I wonder if we would have chosen each other if we'd been in the romantic tradition. And they said they wouldn't, because they're polar opposites. But of course, I see it a bit differently. I think they might well have chosen each other. So these two, Faisal and Bisma, she's very adventurous, try everything, everything's new, moving. He's a very, very steady, cautious anchor person. And those qualities, so they held very different qualities. But the reason it worked is they learned to value and indeed to develop the qualities in the other. So he kind of described how she brought him out of himself. She pushed him to things that he wouldn't do by himself. And he'd learned to foster some of that adventurous spirit. And she spoke very movingly about how his steadiness had enabled them to work as a couple. So that's a developmental fit where each partner begins to really value what's fascinatingly different, rather than becoming more and more entrenched in their roles. And then the familiar is when we tend to spot something that approximates to someone from our early family.
I think it was, and as you said, you sort of distilled this, but I think it was so poignant and so clear, the way that you put it. And I think what I found really useful in reading the book is that while you're talking about these couples, the concepts that you are discussing, like the familiar and the fascinating, and another one that I want to also explore, the pursuer and withdrawer, that these are all concepts that are prominent and useful for everyone, right? That is seeking a relationship. So in being able to look at these couples and the examples that you share, we find ourselves in these examples as well. And it's that the information is so useful as a reader to be able to apply in our own life. I mean, as I was reading it, I thought about many of the couples in my own practice as well, and how these concepts so poignantly relate to it. So talking about that, let's sort of talk a little bit about the attachment styles and the pursuer withdrawer dynamic as well, so the audience members can get a glimpse again into their own psyche and into their own dynamics in their relationship.
Thank you. And I'll go with the first bit of that, attachment as a general concept, because that's obviously a new thing for some people. And I've got a piece I'd like to read on that, which is one of my favorite books. I've got so many favorite bits in this, favorite bits of what the couple said this is. So the couple, I'm going to read a little piece of script, and we call her in the book Kathy, and her husband, they're a heterosexual couple, her husband had a severe stammer, which was a surprise to me when I went to interview them, because the couple, half the couples in the book, I met them live, and then the second half it was on Zoom, but this was a couple I visited in their own home. And I didn't realize until I arrived in the room that the man of this partnership had a really full stammer. Mm-hmm. Like anyone with a stammer, it varied, but when I first arrived, it was very operating strongly. And the couple were very clear that they didn't want the stammer disguised. It's an important part of identity, which is why it's in the book. I'm mentioning that because in the little anecdote I'm going to read, the stammer is important. And this is an anecdote which I think describes the kind of key ingredient to attachment, which is when we find someone is a reliable person who we can turn to when we need help. So Kathy, she speaks to Tim during this. She's trying to put her finger on what really drew her to him. You have this assuredness very early in this relationship, when we were just friends, when I had just met you, we were out in Leeds, and it was late at night in a fish and chip shop. In the north, after the nightclubs close, the fish and chip shops will be absolutely full. I wanted chicken, and there was a sign up that if you wanted chicken, you had to tell them as soon as you went in, because they had to put it in the fryer. But this place was full, and I wouldn't have had the courage to shout across this throng of people, and you just did it for me. And I just remember thinking, even with this stammer, you've got the confidence to just assert yourself across this crowded. I know it's such a small thing, but it's kind of, I think he makes me feel safe.
I can see why it's one of my favorite.
That's secure attachment, yeah.
I can see that. We're talking, Annie, a lot about couples here, but I'm thinking about it from the perspective of some of my clients who are single. Right. What would this book be useful to them? Were you considering individuals that are single but looking for relationships, and how useful or effective the book and the stories might be to them?
Yes, that's a good question. I kind of thought I was doing so. And then I was helped by someone who read the script, which I think I can disclose was one of my own children, who read the script very, very helpfully, kind of quite early on, but when it was in one piece, but still at an early stage, and said that was really missing, and that there was too much sort of determinist, like if you've got a secure attachment, you're going to be fine. And so I kind of went back and I did make sure that I had addressed the single people who are looking for a relationship, and I actually make a section in the appendix which kind of gathers up and summarizes what could be particularly useful to single people. I think one of the things that I found very lovely was that several of the couples spoke about, before they found this relationship that they had been in for a number of years, they had struggled somewhat to find the right person, or they would actually say to be the right person in a relationship. And but because they didn't put it, I searched and searched until I found the right person. What they actually said was, I had a process to go through myself to mature enough to be ready for this good relationship that I'm now in. And that's the kind of people they were. And it's why they're contented couples, because they take responsibility for their own part.
Yes. Yeah. And that's where as I was reading the book as well, I thought, you know, a lot of my single clients could really find this helpful. It's a lot easier to work on a relationship before you've actually in the relationship, right? And in speaking to that point that you just made about working on yourself, right? Because you take yourself into the relationship. So being able to sort of really understand what makes a successful relationship, how to help yourself develop and mature emotionally, and get an understanding of how the usefulness of that and the value of that in a happy, healthy relationship, and as a single person to start doing that and to work on that is really poignant. It's really, really significant. I think the book really did a great job with that. The other point I felt that like was very useful is that you picked a diverse array of couples, right? Different backgrounds, different sexual orientations. And so we really get a glimpse into the fact that the concepts that you brought forward really help every and anyone, right? It's about the heart, it's about the mind. It's not about a specific type of individual. So can you talk about the diversity a little bit? Did you make it a point to choose diverse couples?
I did seek diverse couples, but that in some degrees that wasn't too difficult. In some, I would have liked to make it actually even more diverse in terms of cultural groups, but I definitely did. I went around bothering my friends, acquaintances, and colleagues, saying I'd particularly like to find X or Y, yeah, that I was going to say something else, but I've forgotten what it was. But what actually where I could go with this is the one of the pieces I think perhaps I'll read is it relates to a same-sex couple whose process of learning is particularly clear, where we were just talking about the development of the self and within the relationship. Because I a few times used the analogy that a successful relationship is kind of like a gym. You do your daily workout and grow. Yes. Grow and develop. Perfect. And this couple is two men. They're in the States, and so we've heard already from random romance couples, and we've heard from an arranged marriage. This is what I call a self-arranged marriage. They met. I mean, it's sort of slightly questionable whether they're self-arranged, but I'm calling it self-arranged because they deliberately joined a club for gay dads with the intention of looking for a partner. That's why they joined the club. And so they both went to a supper event, hoping they might find someone, and they did. That's where they met. And they're a couple who talk very strongly about the learning process. Like most of the couples, they had their difficult times to get through. And what they're discussing here is what sometimes is very well understood now in terms of love languages, that people have different ways of feeling cared for. Yes. And expressing love. What did I just ask them? I think I'd been asking them about how they show care. David, I think Jacob gets intimacy just by osmosis. Like if we're together in the same space, it kind of gives him some sort of ease that moderates his nervous system. Whereas I need more interaction, more communication. That's just something we've learned over time. Annie, so those different ways that you feel sustained by the other, how does that show up in how you ask for care from the other? David, I think we had to learn it over time, and I think it was work to figure that out, what each of us needed and the vocalizing of that. He's learned that I like being held physically, but I also want dialogue and exchange, whereas silence is perfect for you. Jacob, I wouldn't say silence, it's listening, having somebody listening in an empathic way. That's like key for me to feel both connected and calm. And David has learnt that. And so I came to see that that wasn't really what David needed. That was a learning curve. There were times when there was conflict. It really has been learning each other's way of feeling comforted and cared about.
I can really see that couple has paid attention to their dynamics, right? And has really come from a place of compassion and understanding. I can see without that intentional conscious awareness of your relationship and of your partner's differing needs, how they could have really polarized themselves into that pursuer withdrawer dynamic. Right? But you can see that they really focused on one another and trying to understand each other and working with that dynamic. Otherwise, again, that sort of the polarization that you really amply discuss in the book can take place. So there is quite a lot that we have discussed, and I want to be able to make sure that the audience is able to engage as well and pose some questions. So I invite all of you now to, if you have any questions for any her own insights, anything about the book, to please engage with us now. And let us know. So I want to begin with one of the questions that was already asked is, did Annie find any relationship between faith, the religion, religious beliefs, and the contented couples? So how did faith or religion play into any of the dynamics between the couples?
It's a good question. And I do address this in a chapter where I look at implicit ways that a couple experience support, because I think faith is one of them. I spoke with couples from a few different faiths, certainly Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, and Christian. The couples who were explicitly Christian were all in the States, which is not a surprise. That's sort of kind of, obviously not so common in this country. I think when it operated as a shared understanding, that was something of an extra bond for the couple. I think one couple in particular had quite a developed, careful theological kind of Christianity, and they actually spoke about that their shared understanding really kind of slightly shaped how they were with each other and how they intended to be in terms of impacting the world. But I think that was to some extent true for some of the couples were more culturally attached to their faith and some were more spiritually attached. Yeah. So I think in both that the cultural bond and the spiritual bond were important. And indeed, there was a couple who don't belong to a religion. It was more a matter of yoga and a kind of more of a new age spirituality. And they were the couple who, in a sense, were most bonded through their spiritual practice.
Yeah, and I think that it sort of speaks to that, potentially the concept of the familiar and the fascinating, right? The familiarity in that. There's when you're coming from faith or religious or spiritual basis or even cultural, there are underlying values and principles that are built in to the ideology, and to then share that in common, it makes it easier to have shared vision, again, shared values, and that really, again, that sort of like the familiar is what sort of stands out to me. Another question is, how can you encourage partners to learn the skills to be curious and open to each other? It's a really interesting one, right? And it's something that I think we try to do within our practice as therapists, is rather than to come from a defensive and angry place to try to get your partner to shift into your own thinking, but how do you actually become open and curious about their style and encourage each other to learn and develop?
Yes, it's the absolute heart of certainly working with couples. I think one of the key ways we do it if we're saying, how do we do it as a couple counselor, for example, I think one of the key ways we do it is by showing real curiosity ourselves, as opposed to what we might call formulaic curiosity, because after all, therapists are always asking questions. But if we're really interested, and I think when curiosity is really working, then it's managing to make the really obvious questions interesting. So there might be some things that people think are kind of obvious, like somebody says, well, sex is very important to me in the relationship, I enjoy it. Well, then we actually want to know, what do you enjoy about sex? Because there's some things people think, well, why ask? It's so obvious. But it's when we can help people be curious about what they thought wasn't even a question to ask, that people can become more excited about their relationship.
Absolutely. And I think that goes for conflicts as well, right? Often when I get a new couple, they're always talking about all of what feels like to them, these sort of petty arguments that we seem to get into and can't let go of. And sometimes when I ask about the argument itself, they can't even remember the details, but it's always that there are underlying issues that people feel strongly about. And when you think you're fighting about the milk, or you're talking about sex, that the surface level concepts are in itself the issue, but really being curious and asking what else is going on underneath it is really it's really helpful to be able to really understand your partner's psychology. And sometimes they themselves don't understand why they feel so strongly about something, and it gives an opportunity for both people to explore together, and for the partner to be a witness to that exploration for the other individual, which in itself is a bonding experience.
Yes. And I think the way we see that working with couples is that we try not to get drawn into the content, because it's really never about the content. And if the couple weren't in distress, they wouldn't need help to sort out how to manage the children. I'm thinking that you definitely asked me, and I didn't respond a lot to the talking about the pursuer-withdrawer dynamics. I would be, shall I read a little bit?
Yes, please.
That, because it is so central. And the understanding of a pursuer-withdrawer dynamic comes from systemic thinking, but it has been particularly developed. One should give credit to Susan Johnson and emotion-focused couple therapy. And the couple I'm going to read from, they are in an arranged marriage, the heterosexual couple. And I sort of emphasize that because a lot of people think that pursuers are always women and withdrawers are always men. And the couple I'm going to read, that is the case, but it really is not the case in general. And the book, as the book shows, because there are same-sex couples where either a man or woman is quite capable of taking either role. And there are heterosexual couples in the book where it's the man who's the pursuer. So it really, in our culture, more women do tend to develop the pursuer dynamic, because it's the conditioning for a girl kind of can evoke it a bit more, but essentially it's an attachment strategy, and that's not to do with gender. So, sorry, I haven't found the right place yet, but I will shortly, I promise you, because I've got it marked. So now I have it. So I'll just read a little bit of explanation from me. A common point of difference between partners is whether they feel an urgent need to talk things through, or whether they prefer to lie low and feel that least said is soonest mended. So the first of those we call a pursuer, and the second a withdrawer. In the book, this difference in strategies is described many times, and we call it the pursuer-withdrawer cycle. The more one goes quiet or distracts and distances from the problem that their partner is wanting to explore, the more desperate the other becomes, until one is harassing and the other shutting themselves in their shed. So I just asked Radesh and Bhavya what happened when they had a row. Radesh, it goes one of two ways. Bhavya, the silent treatment. Radesh, because the more you talk about it, the worse it's going to get. So, sometimes you just have to let it be, and then it slowly gets understood as to what the problem is. Annie, Radesh, and then you solve it afterwards. Bhavya, But if you don't talk about it and you hold it back so much, you're like a spring. You've suppressed it, and it's just unbearable. And then it just pings. And then even other things that you've suppressed come out. I'm one of those people with a stick. I keep reminding and poking. And sometimes it has to come to a real head. And then it's discussed. It's horribly discussed, but we come to an understanding. So one of the reasons I love that passage is you hear someone who, Bhavya, the pursuer, who has such insight into how triggering her behavior might sometimes be. She says, I'm like someone with a stick, I poke.
Yeah. And so speaking to that, one of the questions that came up is how many of the couples actually sought therapy and had the support of a therapist, a mediator, helping them sort of decipher these dynamics, and how many of them sort of just figured it out, like in this example, themselves?
I think of these 18 couples, I think it was 5, might have been 4. I think it was 5 who had some therapy, and they were actually all American ones.
Okay. Yes.
But they all said it had been very helpful. It had been relatively early on in their process.
Yeah. I mean, being American myself, my practice is here and I've been here 11 years, but I grew up and got majority of my education there. I think therapy is seen slightly differently there, especially in California, right? It's something you do like maintenance work, kind of like going to the gym. This is what you do for your relationship or for your own psychology. I would encourage everyone to potentially look into it, regardless of having conflict or not. And I think one of the things that I found very helpful in your book is the questions at the end of each chapter. Right, it really helped individuals reading through it and then to be able to sit down and reflect themselves on their situation, or reflect more deeply on the dynamics between the couples and the insights that the chapter gave, and to be able to sort of take that information and relate it to their own life. So I love when therapists, their books aren't just don't just capture their own sort of like thoughts or what they're talking about, the content in the book, but actually really help the reader in being able to take something and really apply it to their life. And I think the questions themselves were really, really helpful with that. Okay, so another question that I have is, what strategies did couples have for staying together for a long time and keeping their relationship fresh?
That's lovely, right? So there's two questions connected there: staying together for a long time and keeping it fresh. Well, I don't know whether strategies is what comes to mind. I mean, I was looking at how had they done it, and I think in many ways the couple signed up to be interviewed. One reason they think they were willing to be interviewed was they were couples who were valuing that opportunity to reflect. And in fact, more than one couple came to the meeting saying, we were talking about this yesterday, or maybe they'd kind of quite enjoyed the process of reviewing their time together, which the occasion kind of invited. And the things that I think shared expectations was a good one. So that's built in from the beginning, that the expectations are worked out and clear, and shared values. As I said, my own conclusion was that the thing that really made it work was that these were couples who were prepared to learn and who remained curious about their own experience and their partner. And I think that readiness to learn and develop actually answers both questions: how you stay together and how it keeps fresh.
Yeah, because as two people are evolving and developing, because the two people that came together are not the two people that are in the relationship 10, 20, 30, or 40 years from then, right? And so that consistent curiosity, I think sometimes in the initial process of getting to know one another, whether it's dating or when we've first sort of gotten together and gotten married, that we're curious because this is a new person to us, right? But after you've been together for a considerable amount of time, you think you know this individual now in and out, and those dynamics can be really entrenched. But as we know, we're always evolving and we're changing, and the people we are today is not the people we were 5-10 years ago. So there has to be consistent curiosity from both individuals to learn about this partner that they're with, that is an evolving human being that's consistently changing with them. One of the audience members wanted to know about respect. You mentioned that within his own relationship, that respect is a bedrock. A mutual respect for one another is a bedrock of the relationship. Is that something that came up at all with any of the couples?
Well, it's a really good thing to mention, because it's one of those things like sort of the fish in the sea, that it's so important that we can forget it. So it's a good point. I'm grateful for it being brought up. In a sense, it wasn't mentioned that much because it was just there, really. But now and again, it was mentioned. But I think you'd see it more in couples where there had been trouble with disrespect, because although these couples had, almost all of them, not all, but several of them had really stormy times,
Mm-hmm.
there had not been problems with lack of respect. That's not the sort of problem these couples were having.
Yeah, and I suppose that it's, as you said, it's one of those things. It's like water to a fish. It's so a part of how we relate that it's not even something that we're consciously doing. But I think when you're talking about curiosity, it's like you have to respect your partner to be curious about their stance, right? If
Yes.
you're not, if you don't respect them, then it's irrelevant what they have to say or why they are saying it. You tend to sort of want to push your agenda. So I think in reading about the way that the couples, their dialogue that you had written out, that you can see that there is an underlying sense of respect for one another throughout.
Yes, I think there is that underlying respect. And interesting, so I do talk about respect in one chapter, and I'm remembering now, I looked for a piece of dialogue to illustrate it, and it's actually not a very easy thing to illustrate, but I found something in the end that I thought almost did it in a back to front way. And I think that this question sort of relates to the question about single people, because the best preparation for single people for a relationship is deepening their respect for themselves and their compassion for themselves and their curiosity about themselves. And when we have that for ourselves, we'll have it for another person.
Yeah, I remember distinctly reading that somewhere in the book and actually highlighting it in red, where you mentioned that a good relationship with your partner requires a good relationship with the self. Yeah. So on that note, there was a question about therapy and the struggle that you might have getting your partner into therapy, and whether any of the couples had individual therapy, and whether that is even useful to go to individual therapy if your partner is refusing or doesn't want to go to couples work.
I think it definitely can be useful. I'm just thinking about that when couples go to therapy, often one partner is a bit keener than the other. Obviously, sometimes one partner is just against it. One of the couples spoke about how marriage preparation had been important to them. They both had, well, one had a divorce, the other, not sure, but maybe sort of relationships that hadn't worked a bit. So the heterosexual couple, and the woman was the one who was very keen to do the marriage preparation, the man less so. But anyway, he was keen on her, so he went rather reluctantly, and he became so keen that they became a couple who kind of helped lead the marriage preparation for subsequent, in years after that. And I think this can happen, that when a couple go to therapy with one being a bit reluctant, there's a sort of happy thing that the one who's reluctant very often finds, actually, this is more useful than I imagined. And sometimes the one who was so keen on therapy finds, oh, I thought the therapist going to kind of pat me on the back, and it didn't quite work like that. So
I find exactly that. I find that the one less willing to come sometimes really benefits from being in therapy, and actually having a space that they are encouraged and really listened to. Because I think at home, sometimes the conversation can really escalate and you're fighting to be heard. Whereas I think the benefit of being in this space is that we really try to mediate and give both individuals space to express themselves. And I think what I find that most people are surprised at is, I think that they sometimes have this perception about therapy like they're going into a courtroom, right? And that we as a therapist is a judge, and we have to hear each other out and say, you're wrong and you're right, and you know, you win and you lose. And it's really not about that. It's being able to help them uncover what each is trying to have heard, but maybe lacks the communication style or the ability or the space to be able to express it in a way that the other person can really understand and take in. Okay, lots of questions are coming in. Let's see. This one says, I was struck by your comment about attraction to partners who represent the underdeveloped parts of yourselves. I would certainly agree with that. What do you suppose might be the outcome for such a couple if over time those parts in each person becomes more developed? Do they lose interest, or do they come closer together? So when those underdeveloped parts become developed, does that bring couples together, or does that do the opposite?
I think it does the opposite, definitely, because that's a polarization. So if one couple starts off with quite a lot of self-confidence and quite outgoing and ready to sort of speak up for themselves, and the other is rather shy and retiring, if they become more like themselves, then they're going to become polarized, and in the end it becomes one person is hardly speaking and is creeping around the house, and the other one is kind of being in charge. And it's a very bad outcome for both. It's not one person's fault. It's this dynamic between them that's created that. And it's not, so then they're not, rather than growing the underdeveloped part of the self, they're just becoming entrenched in the kind of, actually the defensive part of the self.
So speaking a little bit to that, and going a little bit off tangent into attachment styles, one of the question is, do you think that couples find it helpful to know their attachment style and how they relate to one another?
A really good question. I think it can be, but I don't think it's the only way for people to make sense of the world. But I certainly do think attachment is absolutely a wonderful way of becoming clearer about what's going on inside us and in others. And particularly for a pair, a couple of any sort, actually, it doesn't even have to be a kind of relationship couple. It could be something with a work colleague. Thinking about pursuer withdrawer dynamics, who tends to move towards with that sort of insisting energy, and who tends to withdraw to sort of the sort things out alone type of energy. It's just a very basic towards away dynamic that I think is useful.
So a little to that point, what if sort of this dynamic plays out and there is not a willingness to change, or perhaps that the other person just simply can't meet one's needs? The question is, did you find any disappointments that individuals experienced when their partner was unable to meet any of their needs?
That's an interesting one. I certainly met couples who experience loss, such as not being able to have children, for example. And there was serious ill health, including in children. And loss is that I'm going to that because when we talk about people's needs not being met, these were couples who were able to make a satisfying life and relationship without every box being ticked. You sort of don't get every box ticked, really. And in fact, the process of grieving and adjusting and adapting can be a deepening of the relationship. But I guess the questioner is sort of saying, almost pointing to, if you've got a sort of unequalness, the suggestion is that one person is looking after the other and the other one isn't. Is that, do you think, what's being got at?
I think what the question is sort of trying to get at is, if your partner isn't able to meet all of your needs, right, and there are parts that they either are unwilling to or are unable to meet needs that you have, how do you manage that disappointment in a relationship? What do you do with those unmet?
Yeah, no, it is a really good question, but I think it's interesting that the very talking about the very idea that a partner would meet all our needs, we can see straight away it's not going to happen. And our culture sometimes pushes that on us a little bit too much, that, you know, you should find someone who will meet all your needs, and that's a recipe for disappointment.
So expectations in themselves need to
but there was something else in the way you phrased it that was very interesting, and I was going to suggest, say it again. It was, so the question is, what can you do? How do you manage either the disappointment that your partner is unable or unwilling to meet the need, and what do you do with that need, unmet need? I'm just thinking which experiences in the book came sort of closest to that, but I think that couples are going to make a success of it. Whatever's going on for a couple, they're going to need to find a way to talk about it that is respectful. And as I'm going back to that concept, so if a partner felt that their needs were not being met by their partner, then they're probably going to want to talk about this. The chances are that if there's an unhappy thing going on, then the way people raise the subject is kind of, probably the strategy has already gone a bit crooked. Sorry, I'm getting a bit lost in answering this one, because in a way it didn't, I mean, as far as my couples in the book were concerned, they were contented. There were disappointments. Sure, there were disappointments, but they talked about it. That didn't make it instantly better, but they adjust to loss as other people adjust to loss.
Yes.
But of course, loss can itself be, it doesn't always bring couples together because they have different ways of adjusting to loss.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to the earlier question I had around the good enough marriage, right? That a successful relationship doesn't have to be one in which all of your needs are met. That it has to be good enough, right? And I think that that phrase can be somewhat disappointing or off-putting for some, to think, oh, I don't want a good enough relationship, I want an amazing one, right? But do you want to speak a little bit to that concept?
Yes, and because you did ask me, and it was one I moved away from, and I do address that point in the book, that as therapists, that the phrase good enough is given to us by Donald Winnicott, who's a British psychoanalyst, and almost every couple, almost every counsellor and therapist you find thinks it's a wonderful concept because it's so useful. But when you use it in the wider world, people think, well, why would I want good enough? That's a shame. I don't want to settle for something that's not good enough. But Winnicott's idea, he thought about it initially with mother and baby, and it could be father and baby, but he was thinking about the nursing mother. The idea he put forward is that actually the child develops where, along the rough edges, really. If the mother were able to provide something absolutely perfect and all-encompassing for the child would never be able to grow and mature, which does not mean the worse it is, the more deprived, the better. Of course, it doesn't mean that. It's about having the appropriate amount of disillusionment. And actually the same in a relationship. Of course, if it's terrible or if it's an abusive relationship, that's so far from good enough. That's not a good place to stay. But a relationship that doesn't tick every box, not all needs are met, it may be a place where we can really grow up and develop. But that's for every couple and individual to work out. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's not likely to come right by sort of hammering at our partner to say, you've got to produce more, meet more of my needs. It might come about by a really thoughtful, reflective conversation with partner about why it really matters to me that we go walking together or whatever it is.
Yes. Yeah. Trying to find out the underlying desire behind that need is definitely one way to go about that. And also, yes, to sort of recognize that not every need is expected and intended to be met in a relationship, and that sometimes either we have to grow ourselves in that, or find somewhere else to seek that meeting that need. That it might be a need for more adventure or spontaneity, and we might have a friend that we can go on mini adventures with, or travel, or I think that sometimes in the era of online dating, where we have thousands of people available to us in a click of a button, we are trying to find that sort of perfect person that can meet all of those needs. And I think that the value of the book you've written is that the couples didn't come together through online dating in that way, and they didn't have essentially the opportunity for endless amount of choices to try to find the best possible person for them that can meet every possible need. But it's in the working together and developing together and understanding they have to accept certain things, they have to grow themselves, they have to let go of certain things, that in that process is really built the relationship and the depth of connection between them, not just all the needs that they can get met in the relationship.
And I'm thinking, because we have to wrap up quite soon, don't we? I'm thinking there's a small piece perhaps I'll read, which sort of, I think it addresses this, because I like the way you've summed that up, really, that people do worry very much about this question about, am I getting enough needs met? And I think that what these couples said to me is that the thing that matters in the end is that you've got someone who's with you, that there is this learning together. And so I'm reading a piece from, it's from the Dad's Club couple again. And so this is a piece which really, I think, describes the rewards of a committed relationship, because I have said a bit about the struggles. So one of the struggles that this couple had, here's an example of needs not being met. One of the struggles was that one of them was not actually a hoarder, that would be misrepresenting it, but in terms of shorthand, this is someone who likes to acquire stuff, and a lot of stuff, and likes it arranged all around the place. And the other one really was an absolute minimalist. So we've got a real difference here, and it's not going to go away because that's built into their nervous systems. And so, that they'd been talking about it, and it clearly was an absolutely ongoing thing. That they were mindful of, and they tried to make adaptations for the other, but it was a tension. But this sort of short piece describes, despite that sort of stuff, the reward of being together. So Jacob had been speaking of his early fears that David would leave him. They'd been about 25 years together, but in the early years, they were very, very happy. But Jacob was convinced that it couldn't last. So he spoke initially with real anguish. It's the gift which is beyond anything I ever expected. I mean, 18 years it's the most wonderful thing that's ever happened. And now he was more relaxed, speaking through tears. I feel that almost every day, just grateful that I found him and that he stuck with me, and we worked it out, and he could see who I really was. Despite a lot of rough edges and, things that are difficult, I just feel so blessed. And that's part of why those things don't matter anymore.
Excellent. And I want to be able to actually read a sentence that really stuck out, and you had put in the introduction as well to wrap this up. You said, there are a vast number of potentially fulfilling matches for us. The specialness will hang on how we jointly built the relationship. And I think that this book poignantly talks to that and offers so much helpful content and insight to the readers to be able to take that information and gain a lot of benefit in their own lives, and hopefully gain help and support in understanding their own relationship dynamics. So thank you so much, Annie.
I really appreciate having you, Kathrine, help me talk about it, because that's what this is actually. It's this partnership, isn't it? This is being
Yes.
curious, listening. Yeah. And it's really lovely of everyone to show up on a Saturday morning. So thank you all. And I think Emily and Christina are going to talk now, aren't they? Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, both of you, Kathrine and Annie, for speaking about the book and telling us more about what's in it, and showing the depth and breadth of the content, which I hope everyone will be enticed now to buy a copy if they haven't already. I'm really, really grateful to both Annie and Kathrine and all of everyone who joined us. And just a reminder that many of you will know that we were going to have an in-person event celebration at our bookshop in Spitalfields today, and that this was going to be a live book launch happening in the bookshop. And I just wanted to say I'm sorry that that couldn't take place because of the National Rail strikes. And we will be rescheduling that for the fall. So I hope many of you will also be able to come to another book launch and some more talks in person with us at that point. So that's it, really. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you for celebrating with us.